Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 14 of Pakistan Studies. This lecture will focus on constitutional development in British India. In our previous lectures, we discussed in detail the political developments, how the Muslims of this subcontinent asserted their separate identity and rights in the political domain, in what manner they asked for certain political arrangements, constitutional safeguards for the protection and promotion of their interests. Ultimately, they demanded the establishment of a separate state. While discussing these issues, we were often referring to certain constitutional issues, and we were talking about different Governments of India Acts that were enforced by the British government in this subcontinent. Now, we are going to discuss the contents of different acts which the British government enforced in India from time to time, so that our discussion of the political development is within the backdrop and background of the constitutional changes which the British made in India. This lecture will discuss 5 major constitutional documents. First, the Indian Council Act of 1861. Second, Indian Councils Act of 1892. Third, the Government of India Act 1909. 4, the Government of India Act 1919. And lastly, the Government of India Act 1935. When we look at these 5 acts, which we will be discussing very shortly, what we find is the practice of gradualism. The British introduced political and constitutional changes step by step and gradually. They gradually opened up the political process to Indians. While discussing all this, we must keep in mind that all these major constitutional documents and other actions which the British adopted were basically for a colony. India was at that time a British colony, and from British point of view, the interest of the empire was supreme. So while discussing all these acts, we have to keep in mind this reality that we are discussing the constitutional development in a state which was under the colonial rule of a European power, and in this case, it was the British government. We have to go back to 1858 to start discussing constitutional development. In August 1858, the British Parliament passed a law for the complete takeover of the rights of the East India Company over India. Previously, that is, before this law was passed, East India Company was running India. Although East India Company was set up under a British law and British government had say in the affairs of the state, but it was not direct rule of the British Crown. So in August 1858, that law came in, and they decided that under that law, the Indian administration would be taken over by the British government. In November 1858, the law that has been passed in August became operative. That is, Queen Victoria issued an order, proclamation, assuming all responsibilities of India, and from that time onward, India was now being run directly by the British Crown, and East India Company had been pushed to the periphery, and Queen Victoria also became the head of the state of India, or Empress of India. That was the change. And this change, that is the British Crown directly assuming the responsibilities of India, then began to introduce constitutional changes for running this colony, that is Indian colony, in an effective manner, in a systematic and organized manner. And in this connection, the first legal framework of constitutional significance from the point of view of discussion of political developments in India after 1857 was the Indian Councils Act of 1861, which is the first part of our discussion today. Indian Council Act of 1861 was passed by the British Parliament, and in this Act of 1861, the British government outlined certain broad principles which they thought would be relevant and useful for running administration in India. And therefore, this Act, Indian Councils Act of 1861, becomes important because for the next 30 years, Indian Councils Act was the main framework within which the British Indian government was working, although changes were made, some other laws were brought in, but the basic document was the Act of 1861. And this Act of 1861 provided for the expansion of the Executive Council, that is the Executive Council of the Viceroy, because once the British took over Indian administration, Governor General also assumed the title of Viceroy. So the Viceroy's Executive Council was to be expanded. The Viceroy could hand over some function to some of its members, But important departments were to stay with the Viceroy, like Foreign Department. Foreign in Indian context basically meant the dealings of British Indian government with the princely states, different states that existed in different parts of India, which were not technically under direct British rule. Since it was an important area, an important field, this was being managed by the Viceroy. Another important feature of Indian Consuls Act of 1865 was that the non-official members were to be nominated to the council. And in this connection, Indians could also be appointed to the executive council. And the total strength was raised from 6 to 12 members. This council, in its legislative capacity, was given very limited powers. It was just the beginning. The British desire was not to create really a legislative body. They could not and want to do that at that time. So some powers were given to raise questions, but those were very limited powers which were given under this act. In this case, that is, in the case of Government of India Act 1861, which is also described as Indian Consuls Act of 1861, the most significant development was the nomination of Indians to this council, whose number was raised from 6 to 12. You would recall that when we were discussing Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in one of our lectures, we mentioned that after the episode of 1857, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan wrote a pamphlet, Rasala-e Asbab-e Bagawat-e Hind, the causes of Indian mutiny. In this pamphlet, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had argued that one reason that there was the development of 1857 was that there was no communication between the ruler and the ruled, British and the Indians, because they did not have representations in any bodies or with the government. Therefore, there was no way that the British government could understand or could know what are the people's reaction to their policies and administrative decisions. In the same way, the Indians had no channels through which they could communicate their concerns to the British government. And from Sir Syed's point of view, as projected in that pamphlet, this was an important reason that host of grievances developed and, along with other causes, contributed to what happened in 1857. So he proposed that there has to be some method, some arrangement for communication between the ruler and the ruled. And here in this Indian Councils Act of 1861, we see that the British government takes an important decision. That is, Indians were to be brought into the governmental process, but the system was through nomination. Elective principle was introduced later on, but at this stage it was nomination, which obviously means that the people who were acceptable to the British would be nominated. Nevertheless, it was a beginning that now some Indians would be sitting in such an important council and in this way communicate what the educated Indians were thinking at that time. So this Council Act of 1861 is important in this respect, that the process of induction of Indians into the governmental system begins here. The next important constitutional document is the Indian Councils Act of 1892, which was introduced 31 years after the previous act, 1861, now 1892. Although during this period of 31 years, there were several changes, administrative changes, certain laws were brought in, but the formal changes in the Councils Act came in 1892. Now let's take up the changes that were brought in 1892. The first significant change was that the size of the Legislative Council increased. In case of the Central Legislative Council, the number was raised from 10 to 16, which means little bit more people would be inducted into the council. At the provincial level, again the size varied, although it expanded, like the central body, the size expanded here, but the size varied from province to province. I may give one example. In case of Madras and Bombay, the size was raised to 12, and some changes were made in the case of Bengal also. So far as powers was concerned, there was slight improvement from 1961, but still it was a limited power. For example, again they could ask questions, raise issues, but ultimate power lied with the Viceroy and the Governor General. And here in 1892, some element of elective principle was also introduced. Some of those could be elected through special interests which they had identified, not the individuals but special interests. And one example would be like chambers of commerce or university senate, which ultimately became the electoral college. So here in 1892, you had a very limited introduction of the elective principle, but a very selective and only certain special interests could benefit from that facility. Moreover, the ultimate powers were kept with the Governor General or the Viceroy and the British government. It is that authority, the Viceroy and the British government, who would decide about who would go to these councils, with the exception of certain limited elective element. But generally, the British government could, because of this law, determine who would be sitting there. But if you compare this with 1861, definitely you will find an improvement, a slight improvement, a marginal improvement, but nevertheless, the principle of graduated development or graduated movement goes on from 1861 to 1892. Third important constitutional document was the Government of India Act 1909. By the time the Government of India Act 1909 was enforced, there had been significant changes in the political domain of India. Congress Party had been set up in 1885, and with the beginning of the century, that is the 20th century, it began to make more and more demands on the British government. In 1906, the Congress Party was talking about self-government in India, and that became its demand. In 1906, the Muslim League was also set up, and in the same year, Muslim League had presented its political demand to the Viceroy. So by 1909, there were more political activity, there were Muslim League, there was the Congress Party, and both were making demands on the British system. And it is against the backdrop of these demands that the British government introduced this law, the Government of India Act 1909. This act is also described as the Minto-Morley reforms. What were its major features? That is, the features of Government of India Act 1909. The first important feature was that the legislative councils, whether at the center or in the provinces, their size was expanded. For example, in the central legislative council, the strength of additional members was raised to 60, which was very reasonable strength at that time if you compare this with the Act of 1892. However, the British government maintained official majority. That is, non-officials, some of which were nominated, some were elected, they were in a minority. When we move from central to the provincial level, at the provincial level, the size of the legislative councils varied. For example, in Bombay, Madras, and Bengal, which were 3 presidencies, and also the province of UP, the size was 50. And at the provincial level, the British government decided to give majority to non-officials. So this was a significant change, that at least at the provincial level, if not at the central level, the majority was non-official. However, all non-officials were not elected. Some were there because government nominated them. the powers of the council were also increased. For example, they could discuss budget, but they couldn't really reject it altogether, but they could discuss it. In addition to asking questions, they could move resolutions on issues of importance. However, resolutions passed by the council, whether at the central level or at the provincial level, are never binding. That's the standard principle. Resolutions are recommendations from legislature to the government, and it is up to the government to implement those resolutions, ignore those resolutions. But resolutions provide an opportunity, which they did to Indians at that time after 1909 Act became effective, to raise issues of public importance. The issues which they thought government must take notice of. So they would raise a matter in the form of either question, or they would go for resolution. This was an opportunity to present their point of view, but the British government had enough power to ignore what these people wanted. In this act, that is the Act of 1909, principle of election was expanded. That is, the electorate expanded. The people who could vote, their number increased. But it was still limited. For example, the members could be elected by those who are member of university senate, or members of district board, municipal committees, who were landowners, zemindars, or chambers of commerce. These are few examples of who could vote at that time, that is under the Government of India Act 1909. And definitely the electorate expanded under this act. Another important feature was that the Executive Council for Bombay, Madras and Bengal, as well as for the provinces which had lieutenant governors, was provided for. That is, these kind of councils, executive councils, were also set up at the provincial level. The last but most significant feature of Government of India Act 1909 was the principle of separate electorate for Muslims. Separate electorate implied that the Muslim representatives, whether at the central level or at the provincial level, would be elected by Muslim voters. You would recall that this was a demand which the Muslim delegation presented to the Viceroy, Lord Minto, in 1906. What is often described as the Shimla Deputation, that we have discussed in our previous discussions and lectures. In 1906, the Muslim leaders from all over India had presented a memorandum to the Viceroy, and one of the proposal was the principle of separate electorate. Muslim voters electing their own representative from their own community. At that time, the Viceroy agreed in principle and agreed to look into the matter sympathetically. 3 years later, when this Government of India Act 1909 was enforced, the principle of separate electorate was incorporated. And since then, since 1909 to 1947, when the British rule came to an end, principle of separate electorate existed in India, and subsequently it was extended to some other communities, although initially it was a Muslim demand. So this feature, that is the feature of separate electorate, makes the Government of India Act 1909 as a significant document. Now we move on to the fourth important constitutional framework, that is the Government of India Act 1919, or sometime it is described as the Act of 1919. In order to understand this Government of India Act 1919, we have to give a brief look to the developments during the last 10 years. Previous act came in 1909 and the new act came 10 years later in 1919. During these 10 years, political activity in India intensified. In 1913, the Muslim League adopted self-government as its principle, and there were reasons why the three major communities were perturbed for one reason or the other. In 1914, First World War started, and British joined the war, First World War, and by virtue of British joining the war, India was also involved in the war. In 1916, we have discussed, the Congress and the Muslim League signed the Lucknow Pact for constitutional reforms. Lucknow Pact was a set of proposals which both parties wanted the British government to consider while preparing the new law that ultimately came in 1919. This war period, First World War, 1914 to 1918, was a period of some turmoil in India. And we have discussed those events in detail. We don't have to go into their detail. So in view of this kind of situation, the British wanted to seek the cooperation of Indians for war efforts. The British wanted to secure the cooperation of Indians. For that purpose, they made an announcement on August 20th, 1917. In this announcement, the British government talked of gradual induction of Indians in all branches of government. This was one of the demands which the Indian leaders were making, and here they were saying that gradually Indians will be inducted into all branches of government. Second part of the announcement was that gradually representative or responsible government would be introduced in India. And another part of this announcement was that the Indians would also be inducted to the commissioned ranks of the army. It may be pointed out here that until that date, until 1917, Indians could not hold the commissioned ranks of the Indian army. Commissioned ranks mean all those officer ranks starting from second lieutenant to upwards. Indians could not hold the commissioned ranks in the Indian army. The ranks, the highest ranks they could hold was what was at that time described as the Viceroy commissioned ranks or Viceroy commissioned officer. In the present day context of Pakistan, Viceroy commissioned officer or VCO as the label was at that time could be compared with the non-commissioned officers of the Pakistan army. So the Indians could not go beyond that. In 1917, the British government, on the insistence of Indian leaders, opened the commissioned ranks of the army to Indians, and that system was introduced in 1918. So from 1918 onward, Indians became entitled to hold the commissioned ranks, and gradually they were inducted into the commissioned ranks. But since we are not discussing that, so we will not pursue this point. But basically there were two significant changes that were reflected in the Government of India Act 1919 were gradual involvement of Indians in all government departments and sections, and opening up of the commissioned ranks or induction of the system of responsible government. After that, the important development was that the Secretary of State for India, whose name was Montego, came on a visit to India in November 1917, and he spent several months in India talking to leaders, the British Indian government, on political and constitutional issues. On the basis of these deliberations, a report was released in 1918 called Montego-Chelmsford Report of 1918, and this report became the basis of the Government of India Act 1919. This act was passed by the British Parliament and approved or signed by the King, and by December 1919, this became the basic constitutional document for India. Let's now take up some important features and attributes of this document, that is the Government of India Act 1919, its major provisions. One, the Government of India Act 1919 established a central legislature with two houses, the upper house and the lower house. The upper house, described as Council of State, comprised 60 members, and out of 60, 34 were to be elected, which means that elected were to have a majority, 34 out of 60. The lower house was the Legislative Assembly, whose strength was 145. Out of this, 105 were to be elected, which means 40 will not be elected, will be official and others nominated. So even here we see that the elected element dominates the lower house, and this is the same case when we look at the upper house. The system was that the members would be directly elected, but the only thing was that the right to vote was still restricted. It was not universal adult franchise. There were certain conditions prescribed on the basis of which people could have right to vote. In other words, those who fulfilled those qualifications had the right to vote or were entitled to elect the members to the legislature. Another feature was a continuation of what was there in the earlier acts, that is, the principle of separate electorate, Muslims electing their own representatives to the central legislature as well as the provincial legislature. If we look at the powers of the assemblies, the powers were still limited in scope, nevertheless slightly more than what these were in the past. Most of the budget was not under their control. Same was the case with foreign policy or defense. Although they could discuss all those things, but they could not really totally reject the budget. If they reject a particular grant, the Governor General could approve of it or could sanction that even if it has been turned down. And they could ask questions and they could raise, go for resolutions. And another important thing was adjournment motion, which was there for this assembly. In a way, this assembly, when it came into existence in 1921 and elections were held from time to time, was a lively assembly which dealt with different issues and different kind of problems. When we move to the provincial side, provincial government, we find that here assemblies were of different sizes, and like the federal assembly, their powers were limited. And if we talk of Governor General, Governor General had wide-ranging powers at the central level. And at the provincial level, more or less similar powers were enjoyed by the governor within his own province. So the executive or the Governor General or the governor were very powerful. So far as division of powers are concerned, the Government of India Act 1919 provided a central list and also a provincial list. The most significant feature at the provincial level was the introduction of principle of diarchy. Principle of diarchy meant that you distribute powers at the provincial level. Certain important departments were given to members who were responsible to the Governor General, or in this case, the governor. They were not answerable to the assembly in the provinces. And there were certain subjects described as the transferred subjects, and transferred subjects were given to ministers who were answerable to the provincial legislature. So in this way, the powers at the provincial level were distributed. Reserved subjects, certain members performing that job but answerable only to the governor. Transferred subjects, less important subject, given to others who were answerable to the provincial legislature. This division was creating a lot of problems, but the British didn't want to give so much power to the Indians, therefore they adopted this principle of diarchy. Now we move on to Government of India Act 1935, which was the most comprehensive and significant document in India. The Government of India Act 1935 introduced the system of federalism for the first time. Although its seeds could be found in Government of India Act 1919, but here a federation was established with provinces and the princely states. And the powers between the center and provinces were divided into three lists or three categories: central powers, provincial powers, and the third were concurrent. Both center and provinces could make a law, but law of the center had the overriding status. And other provisions were that the Governor General was given overriding powers, some powers in his discretion, some powers in his individual judgment, and some powers on the advice. Similarly, in the provinces, where principle of provincial autonomy was introduced under Government of India Act, governors had some special powers. However, system of provincial autonomy was introduced, which was the most important feature. And this Act, Government of India Act 35, was introduced only at the provincial level. The central part was not introduced. And in 1937, provincial part as provincial autonomy was introduced, and it became operative from 37, and it lasted till 1947. Let us conclude our discussion of important constitutional document to give you an idea of the constitutional frameworks which the British adopted. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz. Until we meet again.